Let me tell you something that might surprise you. The dream of building a thinking machine is older than electricity. It's older than the steam engine. It's older than the printing press. People have been imagining artificial minds for thousands of years, long before anyone had the faintest idea how to actually build one. And that's where this story begins, not in a Silicon Valley garage, not in a university lab, but in the ancient world, with myths and mechanical toys and a question that humans have never been able to stop asking. Can we create something that thinks? So settle in. Get comfortable. This is a long story, and there's no rush at all. We're going to walk through the entire history of artificial intelligence, from its earliest glimmers to the world you're living in right now, and we're going to take our time with it. Some of this you might know. Some of it, I promise, will surprise you. And if you drift off somewhere along the way, that's perfectly fine. The story will still be here. Let's start with the Greeks, because they were thinking about this before almost anyone else. In Greek mythology, there's a figure called Hephaestus, the god of fire and metalworking, the divine craftsman. Homer describes him in the Iliad, and here's what's fascinating. Hephaestus doesn't just forge weapons and armor. He builds automatons, golden handmaidens that can move on their own, that have intelligence and speech and skill. He builds Talos, a giant bronze man who patrols the shores of Crete, throwing boulders at enemy ships. These aren't just decorative myths. They're expressions of a deep human intuition that if you're clever enough, if you understand materials and mechanisms well enough, you can build something that acts like it's alive. Now, the Greeks didn't have the technology to make any of this real. But they weren't just dreaming idly. Around the 3rd century BCE, real engineers in the ancient world started building actual mechanical devices that mimicked living things. There's a man named Ctesibius of Alexandria, sometimes called the father of pneumatics, who built water clocks and hydraulic organs and mechanical birds that could sing. His student, or at least his intellectual heir, was Hero of Alexandria, who lived in the 1st century CE and wrote entire books about automata, mechanical devices powered by water, steam, air pressure, and falling weights. Hero described a miniature theater where tiny figures would move on their own, acting out a play. No one was pulling strings. The mechanism ran by itself, following a predetermined sequence. Think about that for a second. 2,000 years ago, someone built a programmable sequence of mechanical actions. It's not intelligence, not by any modern definition, but it's the seed of the idea. It's the notion that you can encode a set of instructions into a physical system and let it run. And that idea, that notion of a machine following a program, turns out to be absolutely central to everything that comes later. Fast forward 1,000 years or so, and you find the same impulse popping up in the Islamic Golden Age. Around the early 13th century, a brilliant engineer named Ismail al-Jazari, working in what is now southeastern Turkey, wrote a book called, and I love this title, The Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. Al-Jazari built water clocks, musical automata, and a famous peacock fountain where mechanical servants would offer soap and towels. But here's what's really clever about Al-Jazari's work. Some of his devices used what we'd now recognize as early forms of programmable logic. Pegs on a rotating drum that determined which actions would happen and in what order. It's the same basic principle that would later drive music boxes, player pianos, and eventually, in a much more abstract form, the earliest computers. So there's this thread running through human history, this persistent urge to build machines that behave as if they have minds, And for most of that history, the machines were purely mechanical. Gears and levers and water and weights. The intelligence, such as it was baked into the physical structure. You couldn't change the program without rebuilding the machine. But people kept pushing, kept tinkering, kept asking, how far can we take this? Now, let's jump ahead to the 17th century, because something important shifts. This is the era when people start thinking seriously, not just about mechanical bodies, but about mechanical minds, about whether thinking itself might be a kind of mechanism. And the person who crystallizes this question more than anyone else is René Descartes. You probably know Descartes for, I think, therefore I am. But Descartes was also deeply interested in automata. He lived in an age when elaborate mechanical toys were fashionable in European courts, lifelike dolls that could write, draw, play music. Descartes looked at these machines and asked a genuinely profound question. If a machine can imitate the actions of a living thing, is there any action that a machine could never imitate? His answer was yes. He believed that language, true flexible language, was the dividing line. A machine might be built to utter words, he argued, but it could never arrange them in new ways to respond meaningfully to whatever is said to it. That was something only a soul could do. Here's the thing, though. Descartes was also the person who described animals as essentially biological machines, complex automata with no souls, operating purely by mechanical principles. So in Descartes' framework, the human body is a machine, animals are machines, but the human mind is something extra, something non-mechanical, something that sits outside the physical world and interacts with it through the pineal gland. It's a strange and fascinating position, and it set up a debate that would rage for centuries. Is the mind fundamentally different from a machine, or is it just a very, very complicated one? That question, can a machine think, is the philosophical engine that drives the entire history of artificial intelligence. Every breakthrough, every failure, every heated argument in the field traces back to some version of it. And for a long time, it remained purely philosophical because nobody had the tools to test it. But then, in the 19th century, someone built a machine that started to make the question feel a lot less abstract. Her name was Ada Lovelace, and his name was Charles Babbage, and their story is one of the most remarkable in the history of technology. Babbage, an English mathematician and inventor, spent much of his career trying to build what he called the analytical engine, a general-purpose mechanical computer designed in the 1830s that was staggeringly ahead of its time. It had a memory, which Babbage called the store. It had a processing unit, which he called the mill. It could branch, meaning it could make decisions based on intermediate results and follow different sequences of instructions depending on what it found. It was, in every meaningful sense, a programmable computer designed more than a century before the first electronic ones were built. Babbage never finished building it. The engineering challenges were immense. We're talking about a machine made of thousands of precisely machined brass gears, and the manufacturing tolerances of the 1830s just weren't up to the task. He spent decades and enormous sums of money, and the full analytical engine was never completed in his lifetime. But the design was sound. Modern engineers have built portions of it, and they work exactly as Babbage predicted. But here's where Ada Lovelace comes in, and this is where the story gets really interesting for our purposes. Ada was the daughter of Lord Byron, the poet, though she never knew her father. Her mother, determined that Ada would not inherit Byron's romantic temperament, had her tutored intensively in mathematics and logic. And Ada turned out to be extraordinary. She met Babbage at a party when she was 17, became fascinated by his engines, and eventually wrote a set of notes on the analytical engine that went far beyond anything Babbage himself had published. In those notes, written in 1843, Ada did something remarkable. She wrote what is widely considered the first computer program, a detailed algorithm for the analytical engine to compute Bernoulli numbers. But more importantly for our story, she also wrote about the philosophical implications of the machine. And here's what she said, and I want you to really sit with this, because it's 1843, and she's seeing something that most people wouldn't grasp for another 100 years. She said the analytical engine has no pretensions to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform. It can follow analysis, but it has no power of anticipating any analytical relations or truths. That statement, sometimes called Lady Lovelace's objection, would echo through the entire history of AI. It's the argument that a machine can only do what it's programmed to do, that it can never truly create or think or surprise us. And for over a century, most people agreed with her. A machine is just a machine. It follows instructions. It doesn't understand anything. But Ada also hinted at something else, something that showed just how far ahead she was thinking. She speculated that the engine might one day compose music, not because it would feel anything, but because musical composition follows rules, and rules can be encoded. She was imagining, in 1843, a machine that could produce creative output by manipulating symbols according to formal rules. That idea, that intelligence might be symbol manipulation, would become one of the foundational concepts of artificial intelligence when the field finally emerged a century later. So by the middle of the 19th century, you have all the philosophical ingredients in place. You have the ancient dream of the automaton. You have Descartes' question about whether minds are machines. You have Babbage's design for a general-purpose computer. You have Ada Lovelace's insight that such a machine could manipulate symbols, follow complex programs, and maybe even produce things that look creative. But also her objection that it could never truly originate anything. All the pieces are on the table. What's missing is the mathematics to make it rigorous, and the technology to make it real. And that's exactly what the 20th century would provide in the most dramatic way imaginable. Because the person who would lay the mathematical foundations for artificial intelligence, who would define what computation means, who would ask the question, can machines think, in a way that could actually be tested? That person was about to be born in London in 1912 to a family of civil servants. His name was Alan Turing, and his story is one of the most brilliant, tragic, and consequential in all of modern science. He would change everything: the way we think about mathematics, the way we fight wars, the way we understand minds and machines. And the paper that started it all, the one that would quietly reshape the entire intellectual landscape of the 20th century, came out of a problem that seemed, on its face, like pure abstract mathematics, about as far from practical engineering as you could possibly get. It was a question about the foundations of logic, posed by a German mathematician named David Hilbert, and it asked something deceptively simple. Is there a mechanical procedure that can determine whether any given mathematical statement is true or false? Hilbert believed the answer was yes. Turing proved him wrong, and in doing so, he invented the concept of the modern computer. But the way he did it, the mental leap he made, the imaginary machine he conjured out of pure thought, that's a story worth telling slowly, because it really is one of the most beautiful ideas anyone has ever had. So picture this. It's 1936. Turing is 23 years old, a graduate student at King's College, Cambridge. He's quiet, a bit awkward, the kind of person who runs marathons alone to clear his head and sometimes chains his coffee mug to a radiator so nobody steals it. Brilliant, obviously, but not yet famous. And he's been thinking about Hilbert's problem, this question called the Entscheidungsproblem, which is German for decision problem. And what Hilbert wanted to know was essentially this: can you build a kind of universal truth machine, a step-by-step procedure, an algorithm, we'd say now, that takes any mathematical statement as input and tells you, after a finite number of steps, whether that statement is true or false? Now, Hilbert wasn't just asking out of curiosity. He had a vision for mathematics. He wanted to show that all of mathematics could be placed on a firm, mechanical foundation, that every true statement could be proved, every false one disproved, and that the whole system was consistent and complete. It was a grand vision, and a lot of very smart people shared it. The idea was that mathematics was, at bottom, a kind of perfect machine, and all you needed was the right procedure to crank the handle. But by 1936, cracks had already appeared. A few years earlier, in 1931, a young Austrian logician named Kurt Gödel had published his incompleteness theorems, which showed that any sufficiently powerful mathematical system would contain true statements that couldn't be proved within that system. That was already a blow to Hilbert's program. But the decision problem, the question of whether there's a general mechanical procedure for determining truth, was still open. Gödel had shown that not everything could be proved, but maybe there was still a procedure that could at least tell you, for any given statement, whether a proof existed. Maybe. Turing's approach to answering this was unlike anything anyone had tried before. Instead of diving straight into the logic, he did something incredibly creative. He asked himself, what do we actually mean by a mechanical procedure? What does it mean to carry out a computation? And to answer that, he imagined a person, just a human being, sitting at a desk, following rules, writing symbols on paper. What is that person actually doing? What are the simplest possible operations they're performing? And from that thought experiment, he conjured up what we now call a Turing machine. Not a physical machine, he never built one. It was a mathematical abstraction, a thought experiment, an imaginary device. But here's what it looked like. Imagine an infinitely long strip of tape divided into squares. Each square can hold a symbol, let's say a 0, a 1, or a blank. There's a read-write head that sits over one square at a time. It can read the symbol on that square, write a new symbol, and then move one square to the left or one square to the right. And it has a set of rules, a table of instructions, that tells it what to do based on two things: the symbol it's currently reading and the internal state it's currently in. That's it. That's the whole machine. Read a symbol, check your state, write a symbol, move left or right, change state, repeat. It sounds almost absurdly simple, right? Like a toy. But here's what Turing showed. This little machine, with its tape and its head and its table of rules, can compute anything that is computable. Anything. Any calculation that any computer has ever done or will ever do, from adding two numbers to rendering a movie to running a neural network, can, in principle, be carried out by a Turing machine. It might take an absurdly long time. It might need an absurdly long tape, but it can do it. That's the Church-Turing thesis, and it's one of the most profound ideas in all of science. And then Turing did something even cleverer. He showed that you could build a universal Turing machine, A single machine that could simulate any other Turing machine. You'd just encode the instructions of the machine you wanted to simulate as symbols on the tape, feed them in, and the universal machine would read those instructions and carry them out. Think about what that means. That's a stored program computer. That's the idea that the program is just data, that the same machine can do anything, depending on what instructions you give it. That's the conceptual blueprint for every computer you've ever used. And Turing described it in 1936 in a paper about mathematical logic, a decade before the first electronic computers were built. But the real point of the paper, the thing Turing was actually trying to prove, was about limits. He used his machine to show that there are problems that no Turing machine can solve. Specifically, he showed that the halting problem is undecidable. The halting problem asks, given a Turing machine and an input, can you determine in advance whether that machine will eventually stop or whether it will run forever? Turing proved, through a beautiful diagonal argument, similar in spirit to Cantor's proof that there are more real numbers than natural numbers, that no general procedure can answer this question for all possible machines and inputs. There will always be cases where you simply cannot predict what the machine will do without actually running it and waiting, possibly forever. And that was the answer to Hilbert. No, there is no universal mechanical procedure for determining mathematical truth. The decision problem is unsolvable. Mathematics is not a machine you can crank. There are inherent limits to what computation can do. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's beautiful mathematics, but what does this have to do with artificial intelligence? And the answer is everything, because what Turing had done was define computation itself. He'd drawn the boundary between what machines can and cannot do. And once you have that boundary, you can start asking the really interesting questions. If a machine can do all of this, if it can simulate any computation, run any program, manipulate any symbols, then what, exactly, is the difference between what a machine does and what a mind does? Is there a difference? Turing himself was deeply interested in this question, and he'd come back to it later, in 1950, with a paper that would become one of the most famous and debated in the history of AI. But we'll get to that. First, there's a war to fight, because in 1939, just 3 years after that paper was published, Britain went to war with Germany, and Turing was recruited to work at Bletchley Park, a sprawling Victorian estate in Buckinghamshire that became the center of Britain's code-breaking effort. And the problem he was asked to help solve was one of the most consequential engineering challenges of the 20th century: breaking the Enigma cipher. The Enigma machine was an electromechanical encryption device used by the German military to encode their communications. It looked like a typewriter with a set of rotors on top. When you pressed a key, electrical current flowed through a series of rotating wheels, each of which scrambled the signal in a different way, and the output was a different letter. The rotors turned with each key press, so the same letter typed twice would produce different encrypted letters each time. The number of possible settings was astronomical, on the order of 159 million, depending on the variant. The Germans believed it was unbreakable. Turing and his colleagues proved them wrong. Building on earlier work by Polish mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rojicki, and Henryk Zygalski, who had made remarkable progress on earlier Enigma versions before the war, Turing designed a machine called the bomb. It was an electromechanical device, about the size of a large wardrobe, full of spinning drums that simulated the Enigma rotors. What it did was systematically test possible Enigma settings, looking for contradictions, configurations that couldn't possibly produce the intercepted message. By eliminating the impossible, It narrowed the search space down to a manageable number of possibilities that could then be checked by hand. This is important for our story because the bomb wasn't just a calculator. It was a machine that was, in a real sense, reasoning. It was making logical deductions. It was searching through a space of possibilities and drawing conclusions. It wasn't intelligent, obviously. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do, nothing more. But it was a glimpse of something, a hint that machines could do things that felt, from the outside, like thinking. And the fact that it worked, the fact that it helped shorten the war by an estimated 2 years and saved millions of lives, gave Turing and others a visceral, practical sense of what machines could accomplish when you gave them the right instructions. After the war, Turing turned his attention explicitly to the question of machine intelligence. He worked on the design of early electronic computers, first the ACE at the National Physical Laboratory, then the Manchester Mark I at the University of Manchester. These were real, physical machines now, not thought experiments, vacuum tubes instead of imaginary tapes. And Turing was thinking hard about what these machines could become. In 1950, he published a paper in the journal Mind called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. It opens with one of the most famous lines in the history of science. I propose to consider the question, can machines think? And then, almost immediately, he sidesteps the question. He says the words think and machine are too vague, too loaded with philosophical baggage to be useful. So instead, he proposes a test, a game, really. He calls it the imitation game, though we know it today as the Turing test. Here's how it works. You have a human judge who can communicate via text with two entities in another room. One is a human, the other is a machine. The judge asks questions, reads the responses, and tries to figure out which is which. If the machine can fool the judge, if its responses are indistinguishable from a human's, then, Turing argues, we have no good reason to deny that the machine is thinking, not because it necessarily has consciousness or feelings, but because we have no better evidence for thinking in other humans either. We judge intelligence by behavior, by conversation, by responses. If the machine passes that test, what grounds do we have for saying it's not intelligent? It was a radical proposal, and it's still debated today. But what made the paper really remarkable was how Turing anticipated almost every objection that would be raised against artificial intelligence over the next 70 years. He addressed the theological objection that thinking is a function of the soul, and machines don't have souls. He addressed Lady Lovelace's objection. Remember her? That machines can never originate anything. They can only do what we tell them to do. Turing's response to that one was characteristically sharp. How do we know, he asked, that humans originate anything? Maybe we're also just following rules we don't fully understand. And he addressed the mathematical objection based on his own work and Gödel's, the idea that there are limits to what machines can prove. Yes, he said, but there are limits to what humans can prove too. The existence of limits doesn't mean the machine can't be intelligent within those limits. He even made a prediction. He suggested that by the year 2000, computers with about 100 megabytes of storage would be able to play the imitation game well enough to fool a human judge about 30% of the time after 5 minutes of questioning. That prediction turned out to be roughly in the right ballpark, depending on how generous you are with the judging criteria, which is pretty remarkable for 1950. But Turing didn't just philosophize. He also sketched out, in broad strokes, 2 possible approaches to building an intelligent machine. The first was what he called the top-down approach. programming a machine with all the rules and knowledge it would need, essentially encoding human intelligence directly. The second was what he called the child machine approach, building a simple machine that could learn from experience, the way a child learns, gradually acquiring knowledge and capability through interaction with its environment. That second idea, the learning machine, was decades ahead of its time. It's essentially the idea behind modern machine learning. Turing saw it in 1950. But Turing's story doesn't have a happy ending. In 1952, he was prosecuted for homosexuality, which was a criminal offense in Britain at the time. He was convicted and given a choice between prison and chemical castration. He chose the hormonal treatment. 2 years later, on June 7, 1954, he was found dead in his home, a half-eaten apple beside him, laced with cyanide. He was 41 years old. The official verdict was suicide, though some have questioned that conclusion. It was a devastating, senseless loss, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, destroyed by prejudice and cruelty. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon, and in 2021, his face appeared on the British £50 note. Too late for him, but perhaps not too late for the recognition of what he gave us. And what he gave us was immense. The theoretical framework for computation, the concept of the universal machine. The question, can machines think, posed in a way that could actually be investigated. The idea that a machine might learn. These weren't just academic contributions. They were the intellectual foundation on which everything in artificial intelligence would be built. But ideas need communities to grow. And in the early 1950s, the community that would build AI was just beginning to find itself. Scattered across universities and research labs in the United States and Britain, there were small groups of people, mathematicians, psychologists, electrical engineers, neurologists, who were all, independently, circling around the same set of questions, and they were about to come together in a way that would give their field a name, a mission, and a sense of boundless optimism. The event that catalyzed all of this happened in the summer of 1956 at a small liberal arts college in New Hampshire, and it involved a young mathematician named John McCarthy who had a very specific idea about what he wanted to accomplish, and a very specific phrase he wanted to use to describe it. That phrase was artificial intelligence, and the story of how that phrase came to be, how it beat out half a dozen competing terms, tells you a lot about the politics and personalities that shaped this field from its very first day. So let's talk about John McCarthy for a moment, because he's one of those figures who doesn't always get the public recognition he deserves, even though he's arguably the single person most responsible for AI existing as a distinct discipline. McCarthy was born in 1927 in Boston, the son of an Irish immigrant father and a Lithuanian Jewish mother, both of them active in left-wing politics during the Depression. The family moved to Los Angeles when he was young, partly for his mother's health, and McCarthy turned out to be one of those kids who was just obviously, almost absurdly gifted at mathematics. He taught himself college math from textbooks while still in high school, and when he entered Caltech as an undergraduate, he was already so far ahead that he was taking graduate-level courses. He finished his PhD at Princeton in 1951, studying under Solomon Lefschetz, and by then his interests had already drifted away from pure mathematics towards something harder to define. He was fascinated by the idea of machine intelligence, not as a philosophical question, the way some people approached it, but as an engineering problem. He wanted to build it. Or at least, he wanted to figure out what building it would require. Now, McCarthy wasn't alone in thinking about this stuff. Not by a long shot. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because in the early 1950s, you had this remarkable convergence of people from completely different fields who were all bumping into the same ideas from different directions. Let me give you a sense of who they were. Over at IBM, there was a guy named Arthur Samuel who was quietly working on something extraordinary, a program that could play checkers and actually learn from its own experience. Samuel had joined IBM in 1949, and he'd started building this checkers program partly as a way to demonstrate what computers could do, partly because he was genuinely curious about whether a machine could improve its own performance without being explicitly told how. And here's what's clever about what Samuel did. He didn't just program in the rules of checkers and a fixed strategy. He gave the program a way to evaluate board positions, how many pieces you have, how many kings, how much control of the center. And then he let it play against itself, thousands and thousands of games, adjusting its evaluation function based on what led to wins and what led to losses. This was, in a very real sense, machine learning, decades before that term became the buzzword it is today. Samuel's checkers program would eventually, by the late 1950s, become good enough to beat some quite strong amateur players. And the key insight, the thing that made it revolutionary, was that the programmer didn't have to know the best strategy. The machine figured it out. Then there was Marvin Minsky, who was roughly the same age as McCarthy, and would become his closest collaborator and, eventually, his most significant intellectual rival. Minsky was a New Yorker, brilliant and eclectic. He'd studied mathematics at Harvard, served in the Navy, and then gone to Princeton for his PhD, where he built something remarkable in 1951. It was a machine called the SNARC, the Stochastic Neural Analog Reinforcement Calculator, and it was one of the first artificial neural networks ever physically constructed, not simulated on a computer, but actually built from hardware. It used about 3,000 vacuum tubes and a surplus automatic pilot mechanism from a B-24 bomber to simulate a network of 40 neurons, and it was designed to learn. Specifically, it could learn to navigate a virtual maze, adjusting the connection strengths between its simulated neurons based on success and failure. Think about that. 1951. And Minsky is building a physical learning machine out of war surplus parts and vacuum tubes. It was crude, it was limited, but it worked. The machine learned. And here's something worth pausing on, because it connects back to an idea we've already touched on. Remember Turing's suggestion in his 1950 paper that instead of trying to program adult intelligence directly, you might want to build a child machine that could learn? Minsky's SNARC was, in a way, an attempt to do exactly that. Not by programming rules, but by building a system that could modify itself through experience. It was the bottom-up approach. Start with simple learning mechanisms and let complexity emerge. McCarthy, on the other hand, was increasingly drawn to the top-down approach. Start with logic, with formal representations of knowledge, with symbolic reasoning. This difference in philosophy would define much of AI's history for the next 40 years, and the tension between these two approaches is still, to this day, one of the most important dynamics in the field. But in the early 1950s, that split hadn't hardened yet. People were still exploring, still open to multiple approaches, still figuring out what the right questions even were. And there were others circling the same territory. Alan Newell and Herbert Simon, working at the Rand Corporation and Carnegie Mellon, were developing what they called the logic theorist, a program that could actually prove mathematical theorems from Whitehead and Russell's Principia Mathematica. They finished it in 1955, and it successfully proved 38 of the first 52 theorems in the Principia. For one theorem, It even found a proof that was more elegant than the original. Think about what that means. A machine in 1955 doing something that looked an awful lot like creative mathematical reasoning. Newell and Simon were so excited by this that they submitted their proof to the Journal of Symbolic Logic, listing the logic theorist as a co-author. The journal rejected it. Apparently, the editors weren't ready for machine-authored mathematics. So you had all these people, McCarthy, Minsky, Samuel, Newell, Simon, and others, working on related problems but scattered across different institutions, using different vocabularies, coming from different intellectual traditions. What was missing was a way to bring them together, to create a shared identity and a shared agenda. And that's what McCarthy decided to do. In the fall of 1955, McCarthy drafted a proposal for a summer research workshop. He enlisted 3 co-authors, Minsky, Claude Shannon at Bell Labs, the same Shannon who had essentially invented information theory, and Nathaniel Rochester, also from IBM. The proposal was sent to the Rockefeller Foundation, requesting funding for what McCarthy called a 2-month, 10-man study of artificial intelligence. And right there, in that proposal, is the first known use of the term artificial intelligence. McCarthy chose it very deliberately, and not everyone was happy about it. Here's the thing about naming a field. The name shapes how people think about it. There were other terms floating around at the time. Some people talked about automata studies. Others preferred complex information processing. Norbert Wiener, the MIT mathematician who had founded cybernetics, thought the whole enterprise fell under his umbrella. Cybernetics, the study of control and communication in animals and machines. McCarthy didn't want any of that. He specifically didn't want to be under the cybernetics tent, partly because he thought Wiener's approach was too focused on analog systems and continuous mathematics, and partly, and this is the political part, because he wanted to establish a new field with its own identity, not a subfield of someone else's creation. The term artificial intelligence was bold, maybe even provocative. It made a claim. It said, "We are trying to build intelligence, not simulate it, not model it, not study it from the outside. Build it." The Rockefeller Foundation funded the proposal, and in the summer of 1956, about 10 researchers gathered at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. Now, I should be honest about what this workshop actually looked like, because the mythology around it sometimes makes it sound like this dramatic founding moment where brilliant minds gathered and the field of AI sprang fully formed into existence. The reality was messier and more human than that. For one thing, not everyone came at the same time. People drifted in and out over the course of the summer. The group was small, and the discussions were informal. There was no grand manifesto produced, no founding document that everyone signed. In fact, by most accounts, the participants didn't even agree on very much. McCarthy wanted to focus on symbolic reasoning and formal logic. Minsky was more interested in neural networks and learning. Newell and Simon showed up with their logic theorist and basically said, "Look, we've already done it. We've built a thinking machine." Others were skeptical of all these approaches. But here's what the Dartmouth workshop did accomplish, and it's not nothing. It gave the field a name. It created a network. These people now knew each other, had argued with each other, had shared meals and late-night conversations, and it established a sense of mission, a feeling that this was a real research program, not just idle speculation. The participants left Dartmouth believing that artificial intelligence was achievable, and most of them believed it was achievable soon. McCarthy and Minsky would both end up at MIT, where they founded the MIT Artificial Intelligence Laboratory in 1959. Newell and Simon went back to Carnegie Mellon and built what would become another powerhouse AI lab. And the Rockefeller Foundation's modest investment, about $7,500 if you can believe that, had helped launch one of the most ambitious scientific programs in human history. Now, what followed Dartmouth was a period of extraordinary optimism, and I mean extraordinary. The predictions that came out of this era are, in retrospect, almost breathtaking in their confidence. In 1958, Newell and Simon predicted that within 10 years, a computer would be chess champion of the world. That didn't happen until 1997. They also predicted that within 10 years, a computer would discover and prove an important new mathematical theorem. Simon later doubled down, predicting in 1965 that machines will be capable, within 20 years, of doing any work a man can do. That would have been 1985. I don't need to tell you that didn't happen either. But here's the thing. This optimism wasn't irrational. It wasn't wishful thinking from people who didn't understand the problems. These were some of the smartest people alive, and they had genuine reasons for their confidence. The early results were genuinely impressive. The logic theorist proved theorems. Samuel's checkers program learned. Programs were being written that could solve algebra problems, play chess at a basic level, even engage in what looked like rudimentary conversation. If you were standing in 1958 and you looked at the trajectory, from nothing to theorem proving in just a few years, extrapolating forward to human-level intelligence in a decade or two, didn't seem crazy. It seemed like the obvious conclusion. The problem, as we'll see, was that the early problems turned out to be the easy ones. The things that seemed hard to humans, proving theorems, playing chess, turned out to be relatively straightforward for computers. And the things that seemed easy to humans, recognizing a face, understanding a sentence, walking across a room without falling over, turned out to be almost impossibly difficult. This inversion, this discovery that human intuition about what's hard and what's easy is almost exactly backwards when it comes to AI, would take years to fully appreciate, and it would lead to some very painful reckonings. But that reckoning was still in the future. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the mood was electric. Funding was flowing, mostly from the military. DARPA, which was then called ARPA, was pouring money into AI research with remarkably few strings attached. And the researchers were building things that genuinely pushed the boundaries of what anyone thought machines could do. One of the most fascinating projects from this era, and one that would spark a controversy still echoing through the field today, was a program called Eliza. Created by Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT between 1964 and 1966, Eliza was, on the surface, a remarkably simple program. And that simplicity is precisely what made it so unsettling, not to the people who dismissed it, but to the people who believed in it. Here's what Eliza did. You'd sit at a terminal, type a sentence, and Eliza would type a response. It was a conversation, or at least it looked like one. Weizenbaum designed it to simulate a Rogerian psychotherapist. That's a style of therapy where the therapist mostly reflects your own statements back to you, asks open-ended questions, and avoids giving direct advice. It was a brilliant choice because it meant the program didn't actually need to understand anything. If you typed, "I'm feeling sad today," Eliza might respond with, "Why do you say you are feeling sad today?" If you typed, "My mother doesn't understand me," Eliza might say, "Tell me more about your family." The program worked through pattern matching. It scanned your input for keywords, applied simple transformation rules, and generated responses that sounded empathetic and probing. There was no comprehension happening, no model of the world, no understanding of what sadness is or what a mother is, just string manipulation. Clever, elegant string manipulation, but string manipulation nonetheless. And here's what shocked Weizenbaum. People fell for it. Not just casual users, his own secretary, who knew it was a program, who had watched him build it, asked him to leave the room so she could have a private conversation with Eliza. Psychiatrists wrote papers suggesting that Eliza could eventually replace human therapists. People poured their hearts out to this thing, confessing fears and anxieties, treating it as a genuine confidant. Weizenbaum was horrified. He hadn't set out to prove that machines could think. He'd set out to demonstrate how superficial human-computer interaction really was, how easy it was to create the illusion of understanding without any actual understanding. And instead, people took the illusion for the real thing. This shook Weizenbaum deeply. So deeply that he spent the next decade becoming one of the most vocal critics of artificial intelligence, eventually writing a book in 1976 called Computer Power and Human Reason, where he argued that there were things computers should never be used for, even if they someday could do them. He became something of a pariah in the AI community. Here was a computer scientist at MIT, surrounded by Minsky and the true believers, arguing that the whole enterprise was not just technically flawed, but morally dangerous. His colleagues thought he'd lost his nerve. He thought they'd lost their judgment. But think about what Eliza actually revealed. It exposed something fundamental about human psychology, our overwhelming tendency to project intelligence and understanding onto anything that behaves in roughly the right way. You don't need a machine that actually thinks. You just need a machine that responds in patterns that trigger our social instincts, and we'll do the rest. We'll fill in the gaps. We'll assume there's a mind behind the words. This insight, that the appearance of intelligence and actual intelligence are very different things, and that humans are terrible at telling them apart. This is something the field is still wrestling with today. Every time you read about someone claiming their chatbot is sentient, every debate about whether large language models truly understand anything, Eliza's ghost is in the room. Now, while Weizenbaum was accidentally discovering the psychology of human-computer interaction, the mainstream of AI research in the 1960s was charging ahead on a very different front. The dominant paradigm was symbolic AI, the approach championed by Newell and Simon and McCarthy. The idea that intelligence is fundamentally about manipulating symbols according to rules. And the flagship project of this era, the thing that was supposed to prove that machines could genuinely reason about the world, was something called the general problem solver. Newell and Simon had built this starting in the late 1950s, refining it through the early 1960s. The GPS, that's what everyone called it, was designed to be a universal reasoning engine. You'd give it a problem described in a formal language, define the initial state, the goal state, and the legal operations, and GPS would search for a sequence of steps to get from here to there. It used a technique called means-ends analysis, which is actually pretty intuitive. You look at where you are and where you want to be, you identify the biggest difference between those two states, and you find an operation that reduces that difference. Then you repeat. If you can't apply the operation directly, you set a sub-goal to get yourself into a position where you can. It's basically how you solve a lot of problems in real life. You break the big problem into smaller problems, solve those, and work your way toward the answer. And GPS could solve things. It could do logic proofs. It could solve simple puzzles like the Tower of Hanoi. It could handle certain kinds of planning problems. Newell and Simon were genuinely excited. They believed they were uncovering the fundamental architecture of human thought, not just building a tool, but discovering how minds actually work. Simon, in particular, made some extraordinary claims. In 1957, he predicted that within 10 years, a computer would be chess champion of the world, that a computer would discover and prove an important new mathematical theorem, and that most theories in psychology would take the form of computer programs. Bold predictions. And wrong, as it turned out, spectacularly wrong on the timeline, though some of them did eventually come true decades later. The problem with GPS and with symbolic AI more broadly was what came to be called the knowledge problem. GPS could reason beautifully within a tidy, well-defined problem space. But the real world isn't tidy or well-defined. To do anything useful in the real world, you need vast amounts of common-sense knowledge. The kind of knowledge that every 5-year-old has, but that nobody had any idea how to give a computer. You know that water is wet, that you can't push something with a rope, that if you drop an egg it breaks, that people generally don't enjoy being punched in the face. You know millions of these things, and you use them constantly, effortlessly, without even noticing. Try to write them all down as formal rules, and you'll be at it for the rest of your life, and you still won't be done. This is sometimes called the common sense knowledge problem, and it's one of the deepest challenges in all of AI. A researcher named Doug Lenat actually tried to solve it by brute force starting in 1984. He launched a project called Psych, short for encyclopedia, with the goal of manually encoding all of common sense knowledge into a massive database of logical assertions. Millions of them. The project is still going, decades later, and while it's produced some useful things, it has never come close to giving a machine the kind of fluid, flexible common sense that even a small child possesses. The sheer scale of what we know without knowing that we know it. It's staggering. But let's come back to the 1960s, because there's another thread we need to pick up. Remember the neural network side of things. The bottom-up approach, Minsky's snark. The idea that instead of programming intelligence from the top down, you could build systems that learn from experience. That thread was still alive in the early 1960s, and its most prominent champion was a man named Frank Rosenblatt. Rosenblatt was a psychologist at Cornell, and in 1958, he unveiled something called the perceptron. It was both a concept and a physical machine, the Mark I. Perceptron was built with custom hardware at the Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory, funded by the Office of Naval Research. The idea was inspired by how neurons work in the brain. You have a set of inputs, each with an adjustable weight. The inputs get multiplied by their weights, summed up, and if the total exceeds a threshold, the unit fires, it outputs a 1. Otherwise, it outputs a 0. Simple, right? But here's the clever part. You could train it. You'd show it examples. Say, images of letters projected onto a grid of photocells. And if it got the answer wrong, you'd adjust the weights slightly in the direction that would have given the right answer. Do this enough times, and the perceptron would learn to classify patterns. It would learn to distinguish, say, the letter A from the letter B, not because anyone programmed the rules for what an A looks like, but because it gradually tuned its own weights through experience. The Navy held a press conference in 1958, and the New York Times ran a story saying the perceptron was the embryo of a computer that the Navy expected would eventually be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. Which was, to put it mildly, a stretch. Rosenblatt himself was enthusiastic, but not quite that unhinged. He genuinely believed perceptrons represented a path toward machine intelligence, and he had theoretical results showing that a perceptron could learn any pattern it was capable of representing. That last part, capable of representing, turned out to be the critical caveat. Because in 1969, Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert published a book called Perceptrons that changed everything. Minsky, remember, had built one of the first neural networks himself with SNARK back in 1951. But by the late 1960s, he had become firmly committed to the symbolic approach, and he and Papert set out to mathematically demonstrate the limitations of perceptrons. And they succeeded, devastatingly. They proved that a single-layer perceptron, the kind Rosenblatt had been working with, couldn't learn certain simple functions. The most famous example was XOR, the exclusive OR function. Given two binary inputs, XOR outputs 1 if exactly one of the inputs is 1 and 0 otherwise. It's a trivially simple logical function, and a single-layer perceptron literally cannot learn it. Minsky and Papert proved this rigorously. Now here's where it gets complicated and a little tragic. The limitation applied specifically to single-layer perceptrons. Multi-layer networks, perceptrons stacked on top of each other with hidden layers in between, could in principle learn XOR and much more complex functions. Minsky and Papert acknowledge this in the book, but they expressed deep skepticism that anyone would find an effective way to train multi-layer networks, and the effect of the book was catastrophic for neural network research. Funding dried up almost overnight. Researchers who had been working on neural approaches found they couldn't get grants, couldn't get published, couldn't get hired. The symbolic AI camp had won decisively, and neural networks entered what amounted to a dark age that would last for more than a decade. Rosenblatt himself didn't live to see the revival. He died in a boating accident on Chesapeake Bay in 1971, on his 43rd birthday. Some of his supporters have always harbored a quiet bitterness about how Minsky and Papert's book was received. Not because the mathematics was wrong, it wasn't, but because the conclusions drawn from it were far broader than the proofs warranted. The book killed a promising line of research based on limitations that applied to the simplest version of the technology, while the more powerful versions were dismissed with a wave of the hand. It would take until the 1980s for neural networks to claw their way back into respectability, and when they did, it would be through exactly the multi-layer approach that Minsky and Papert had been so skeptical about. But that comeback story belongs to a later part of our journey. For now, what matters is understanding the landscape of AI in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Symbolic AI was dominant. Neural networks were in exile, and the symbolic approach was producing some genuinely impressive specialized systems, programs that could solve calculus problems, programs that could analyze chemical compounds. A system called SHAR-DLU, built by Terry Winograd at MIT in 1970, that could understand natural language commands, but only about a tiny simulated world of colored blocks on a table. You could type, "Pick up the big red block," and SHAR-DLU would do it, and you could ask it, "Why did you put down the green block?" And it would explain its reasoning. It was beautiful within its little blocks world. But the moment you tried to extend it to anything more complex, anything approaching the messiness of real human language and real-world knowledge, it fell apart completely. Winograd himself eventually concluded that the whole approach was fundamentally limited, and he largely left AI research to work on other things. And this pattern, dazzling demos in constrained domains, followed by complete failure to generalize, this was becoming the defining rhythm of AI in this period. The researchers kept building systems that could do remarkable things in narrow, carefully controlled settings, and then discovering that the gap between those controlled settings and the real world was not a small gap you could bridge with a little more work. It was a chasm. And on the other side of that chasm, something was waiting that would hit the entire field like a freight train. The people holding the purse strings, the government agencies, the military funders, the people who had been writing those generous checks with few questions asked, they were starting to notice that the grand promises of the early years weren't being kept. And they were getting impatient. In Britain, a mathematician named James Lighthill was about to be asked a very pointed question by the Science Research Council. After all this money, after all these promises, what exactly has artificial intelligence actually delivered? And his answer, when it came in 1973, was devastating. Lighthill didn't mince words. His report, formally titled Artificial Intelligence: A General Survey, essentially argued that AI researchers had failed to achieve the ambitious goals they'd set for themselves, and that most of the progress they had made amounted to little more than clever automation, things that could have been accomplished without invoking the grand banner of artificial intelligence at all. He was particularly harsh on what he called the combinatorial explosion problem, which is actually a really elegant way of framing why so many of these early systems hit a wall. Let me explain what he meant, because it matters. Imagine you're trying to plan a route through a city with 10 intersections. At each intersection, you can go left or right. That's 2 choices at each point, so the total number of possible routes is 2 multiplied by itself 10 times. That's 1,024 possible paths. Manageable. Now imagine 100 intersections. 2 to the power of 100 is a number so large it has 30 digits. And real-world problems, translating a language, understanding a scene, planning a day, they don't have 2 choices at each step. They have thousands, millions. The number of possible combinations explodes so fast that no computer, no matter how powerful, can just search through all of them. And Lighthill argued, correctly, that AI researchers had not found any general way around this problem. Their systems worked in small, constrained domains precisely because those domains were small enough that the combinatorial explosion hadn't yet become unmanageable. But scaling up, that was where everything broke. The impact of the Lighthill report was immediate and brutal, at least in Britain. The Science Research Council essentially pulled the plug on AI research at every British university except Edinburgh, and a couple of other places that managed to hang on. Funding dried up almost overnight. Researchers who had built their careers in AI found themselves scrambling for grants, rebranding their work, or leaving the field entirely. And this wasn't just a British phenomenon. In the United States, similar disillusionment was setting in. DARPA, which had been AI's most generous patron, started demanding more concrete results and shorter timelines. The era of open-ended, blue-sky AI funding was over. This period, roughly the mid-1970s, is what people now call the first AI winter. And that metaphor is apt, because it really did feel like a season changing. The excitement, the optimism, the sense that machine intelligence was just around the corner. All of that froze. Graduate students were advised not to put artificial intelligence on their resumes. Conferences shrank. Papers went unread. The field didn't die, but it contracted painfully, and the researchers who stayed had to become much more modest in their claims and much more practical in their focus. Here's what's interesting about AI winters, though. Work doesn't actually stop. It just goes underground, gets quieter, gets more focused. And some of the most important foundational work in AI happened during this exact period, precisely because the hype had been stripped away. And the people who remained were the ones who genuinely cared about solving real problems rather than making headlines. One of those people was Edward Feigenbaum at Stanford. While the grand dream of general intelligence was collapsing under its own weight, Feigenbaum had been quietly building something much more practical: expert systems. The idea was beautifully simple. Instead of trying to build a machine that could think about anything, that impossible general intelligence, you'd build a machine that knew a lot about one specific thing. You'd sit down with a human expert, a doctor or a chemist or a geologist, and you'd carefully extract their knowledge, all their rules of thumb, their decision-making heuristics, the patterns they'd learned over decades of experience. Then you'd encode all of that into a computer program as a series of if-then rules. If the patient has a fever and a stiff neck and a rash that doesn't blanch when you press on it, then consider meningococcal meningitis. If the rock sample shows these mineral signatures at this depth, then the probability of an oil deposit is such and such. Feigenbaum's first major expert system was called Dendril, and it actually predated the AI winter. He started it in the mid-1960s with Joshua Lederberg, a Nobel Prize-winning geneticist. Dendril could analyze mass spectrometry data and figure out the molecular structure of unknown chemical compounds, and it was genuinely useful. Chemists actually used it. It wasn't a demo. It wasn't a toy. It was a tool that did real work better than most humans could. Then came mycin, developed at Stanford in the early 1970s by Feigenbaum's student Edward Shortliff. Mycin diagnosed bacterial infections and recommended antibiotics. In blind tests, mycin's recommendations were rated as good, as or better than those of most physicians. Think about that for a second. A computer program in the 1970s, running on hardware less powerful than the cheapest phone you can buy today, was matching the diagnostic accuracy of trained doctors in a specific domain. And this is where the story gets commercially interesting, because expert systems turned out to be the thing that pulled AI out of its first winter. By the early 1980s, companies were starting to realize that these systems could actually save them money. The one that really broke things open was R1, also called XCON, developed at Carnegie Mellon for Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, one of the big computer manufacturers of the era. R1's job was to configure VAX computer systems. When a customer ordered a VAX, they'd specify what components they wanted, and someone had to figure out how to actually put all those components together. Which boards went in which slots, what cables connected where, how the power supply handled the load. It was a complicated task that required specialized knowledge, and DEC's human configurators were making expensive mistakes. R1 automated the whole thing. By 1986, it was saving DEC an estimated $40 million a year. That number got people's attention. Suddenly, every major corporation wanted an expert system. The market exploded. Companies like Technology and IntelliCorp and Inference Corporation sprang up to build and sell expert system tools. Japan announced its fifth-generation computer project in 1982, a massive government initiative to build intelligent computers, and the United States and Britain panicked that they were falling behind and poured money back into AI. In the US, DARPA created the Strategic Computing Initiative with over $1 billion in funding. In Britain, the ALVI program reversed the Lighthill-era cuts. It was an AI boom, and the center of it was expert systems. But here's the thing about expert systems, and this is where the pattern repeats itself in a way that's almost painful to watch. They had a fundamental problem, and it was the same problem that had plagued every other approach. They were brittle. An expert system knew exactly what it had been told, and nothing more. It couldn't learn from experience, it couldn't handle situations that fell outside its rules, and it couldn't explain its reasoning in any deep sense. It could tell you which rules it had fired, but it couldn't tell you why those rules were true. And building them was incredibly labor-intensive. You needed knowledge engineers to spend months or years interviewing human experts, teasing out their knowledge, and encoding it as rules. The knowledge acquisition bottleneck, they called it. Getting the knowledge out of people's heads and into the machine was agonizingly slow and expensive. And the systems were fragile in surprising ways. A medical expert system trained on data from one hospital might give bad recommendations at another hospital where the patient population was different, or where different lab equipment produced slightly different readings. A geological expert system tuned for one oil field might be useless in another. Each new domain, each new context required essentially starting over from scratch. By the late 1980s, the cracks were showing. Companies that had spent millions on expert systems were discovering that maintaining them was almost as expensive as building them. Every time the domain knowledge changed, new regulations, new products, new scientific findings, someone had to manually update the rules. And the fifth-generation project in Japan, that ambitious government initiative that had spooked the West into action, it quietly failed to achieve its goals. The intelligent computers it promised never materialized. The British ALVI program wound down without producing the commercial breakthroughs it had hoped for. And so, the second AI winter arrived, settling in around 1987 and lasting well into the early 1990s. The expert system companies collapsed. Inference Corporation, Technology, IntelliCorp. They all either went bankrupt or pivoted to other things. The specialized hardware that had been built to run AI programs, machines made by companies like Symbolic and Lisp Machines Inc., became obsolete as general-purpose workstations got faster and cheaper. Once again, artificial intelligence became a term that serious researchers avoided. Once again, graduate students were warned away from the field. Once again, the gap between promise and delivery had proven too wide. But remember what I said about the first winter? That the most important work often happens in the quiet periods? The same thing was about to happen again, and this time, the quiet work that was being done would eventually change everything. Because while the expert systems boom was inflating and bursting, a small group of researchers had been stubbornly, persistently working on the approach that Minsky and Papert had supposedly killed back in 1969. Neural networks, the connectionist approach. The idea that instead of programming intelligence from the top down with explicit rules, you could grow it from the bottom up by building networks of simple units that learned from data. The key figure here, and this is someone whose persistence borders on the heroic, is Geoffrey Hinton. Born in London in 1947, Hinton came from a family of accomplished scientists. His great-great-grandfather was George Boole, the mathematician whose Boolean algebra underpins all of digital computing. Hinton studied experimental psychology at Cambridge, then went to Edinburgh for his PhD in artificial intelligence, arriving right around the time the Lighthill Report was making AI a dirty word in British academia. And from very early on, Hinton was convinced that neural networks were the right path to machine intelligence, even when almost everyone around him said it was a dead end. He once described his position during this period as being like someone who believed the Earth was round when everyone else thought it was flat. Except that the flat earthers had a mathematical proof, Minsky and Papert's book, that seemed to back them up. What Hinton understood, and what he spent decades working to prove, was that the limitations Minsky and Papert had identified applied only to single-layer networks. If you could stack multiple layers of artificial neurons on top of each other and find a way to train them, find a way to adjust all those connection weights so the network actually learned to do something useful, then the XOR problem and all the other limitations would simply vanish. The question was, how? How do you train a network with multiple layers? When the network gets an answer wrong, how do you figure out which connections in which layers need to be adjusted, and by how much? This was called the credit assignment problem, and it was the central obstacle standing between Hinton and the future he believed in. And the answer, when it finally came together, was an idea so elegant that once you understand it, you almost can't believe it took so long. The technique is called backpropagation, short for backpropagation of errors. And here's the thing, Hinton didn't invent it from scratch. The core mathematical idea had been floating around for years, discovered and rediscovered independently by several people. A Finnish mathematician named Seppo Linnainmaa had described the basic method of automatic differentiation back in 1970. Paul Werbos, an American researcher, had outlined how it could apply to neural networks in his 1974 PhD thesis at Harvard. But Werbos's work was largely ignored at the time. The AI community had moved on from neural networks, remember, and nobody was paying attention to a graduate student suggesting you could train them with calculus. So what Hinton did, along with David Rumelhart and Ronald Williams, was take this idea, refine it, demonstrate it convincingly, and publish it in 1986 in the journal Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific publications in the world. And that paper changed everything. Let me explain why. Imagine you have a neural network with an input layer, a couple of hidden layers in the middle, and an output layer. You feed it some data, say an image of a handwritten digit, and the network produces an output. Its guess at what digit it's looking at. At first, the network's weights are random, so its guess is basically garbage. It says 7 when the answer is 3. Now, you can easily calculate the error, the difference between what the network said and what the correct answer was. The question is, how do you push that error backward through the network to figure out how to adjust each individual weight? Backpropagation does exactly what the name suggests. It propagates the error backward, layer by layer, using the chain rule from calculus. Think of it like this. If you're at the end of a long assembly line and the final product comes out wrong, you need to trace back through every station and figure out which worker at which station made which mistake and by how much. Backpropagation gives you a systematic, mathematically precise way to do that. For every single connection weight in the network, it tells you, if you nudge this weight up a tiny bit, does the overall error go up or down, and by how much? Then you adjust all the weights a little bit in the direction that reduces the error. You do this thousands, millions of times, with thousands of training examples, and gradually, sometimes very gradually, the network learns. It's a beautiful idea, and the reason it was so important is that it finally gave researchers a practical way to train multi-layer networks. The thing Minsky and Peppert said couldn't do interesting work, single-layer perceptrons, that was true. But with backpropagation, you could train networks with 2, 3, 4 layers, and suddenly those networks could learn to represent incredibly complex patterns. XOR, trivial, but also much, much more. The 1986 paper kicked off what's sometimes called the connectionist revival, or the PDP revolution. PDP standing for Parallel Distributed Processing, which was also the title of a hugely influential 2-volume book that Rumelhart and James McClelland published that same year. and for a while, there was genuine excitement. Neural networks could learn to recognize patterns in data. They could do things that symbolic AI found incredibly difficult, like recognizing handwritten characters or learning to pronounce English words from text. A network called NetTalk, built by Terence Sinowski and Charles Rosenberg in 1987, learned to read English text aloud, and listening to it improve over the course of training, going from babble to recognizable speech, was genuinely eerie. It felt like watching something learn. But here's the thing. Even with backpropagation, there were serious practical limits. The computers of the late 1980s were slow. Training even a modest neural network took a long time. And as you added more layers, which is what you needed for truly complex problems, training became harder, not just slower. The gradients, those error signals flowing backward through the network, had a tendency to either shrink to almost nothing as they passed through many layers, a problem called the vanishing gradient, or occasionally explode to enormous values. Either way, deep networks with many layers, were almost impossible to train effectively. 2 or 3 hidden layers worked okay. 10 layers? Forget it. So through the 1990s, neural networks found some practical niches. Yann LeCun, a French researcher who had studied with Hinton, developed convolutional neural networks, a specialized architecture inspired by how the visual cortex processes images, and used them to build systems that could read handwritten checks for banks. That was a real deployed money-making application. A T&T and NCR used LeCun's system to process millions of checks. But in the broader AI research community, neural networks were again falling out of fashion. A new set of techniques had arrived: support vector machines, random forests, other statistical methods that were mathematically cleaner, easier to analyze, and often performed just as well on the benchmark problems of the day. At major machine learning conferences in the late 90s and early 2000s, if you submitted a paper about neural networks, you had a hard time getting it accepted. The field had moved on. Again. And this is where Hinton's stubbornness really matters. Because he didn't move on. He kept working on neural networks through the 90s, through the 2000s, when it was unfashionable, when funding was scarce, when his graduate students worried about their career prospects. He moved to the University of Toronto, built a small but dedicated group, and kept pushing. He once joked that he had to keep changing the name, calling them connectionist models, or deep belief networks, or representation learning, just to get people to listen. But underneath the rebranding, the core conviction never changed. Large networks of simple units, trained on data, were the path to intelligence. And then, around 2006, Hinton and his student Ruslan Salakutdinov published a paper showing a clever new way to pre-train deep networks, layer by layer, using something called restricted Boltzmann machines, then fine-tune the whole thing with backpropagation. It was a workaround for the vanishing gradient problem, and it actually let you train networks with many layers. The results were startling. On standard benchmark tasks, these deep networks outperformed everything else. The term deep learning started appearing in papers, and this time people paid attention. But the real earthquake came in 2012, and it came from a competition. The ImageNet Large-Scale Visual Recognition Challenge was an annual contest where teams competed to build the best image classification system. ImageNet was a massive dataset, over 1 million labeled images in 1,000 categories. Dogs, cars, mushrooms, saxophones, everything. The best systems in previous years used carefully hand-engineered features combined with traditional machine learning classifiers, and they'd been improving incrementally, a percentage point or two per year. In 2012, a team from the University of Toronto, Hinton, and two of his students, Alex Krzyzewski and Ilya Sutskever, entered a deep convolutional neural network they called AlexNet. It had 8 layers, about 60 million parameters, and it was trained on 2 graphics processing units, GPUs, chips originally designed for video games that turned out to be spectacularly good at the kind of parallel math neural networks need. AlexNet didn't just win, it crushed the competition. Its error rate was about 15%, compared to over 25% for the next best system. That's not an incremental improvement. That's a revolution. And the AI community noticed. Within a year, almost every competitive entry in ImageNet was a deep neural network. Within 2 years, the entire field of computer vision had pivoted. And it wasn't just vision. Deep learning started beating existing methods in speech recognition, in natural language processing, in drug discovery, in game playing. The dam had broken. Now, why did it work in 2012 when it hadn't worked in 1992? 3 things came together. First, data. The internet had generated enormous data sets for training. ImageNet itself was only possible because of the web. Second, compute. GPUs gave researchers orders of magnitude more processing power than they'd had before, and Krzyzewski's insight to use them for neural network training was crucial. And third, algorithmic improvements. Better activation functions like ReLU, better regularization techniques like dropout, which Hinton's group also pioneered, better ways to initialize weights. None of these 3 factors alone would have been enough. It was the convergence that mattered. And here's what's worth sitting with for a moment. Geoffrey Hinton had been working on neural networks for over 30 years by the time AlexNet won ImageNet. 30 years of being told he was wrong, of watching funding dry up, of seeing his students struggle to get jobs, of having papers rejected. And he just kept going. There's something almost geological about that kind of persistence, like watching a river carve a canyon. You don't see it happening day to day, but given enough time, it reshapes the landscape entirely. The years after 2012 moved fast. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Baidu. The big technology companies recognized what was happening and started hiring every deep learning researcher they could find. Hinton himself joined Google in 2013, along with his students, when Google acquired a small startup they'd formed. Jan LeCun became the head of Facebook's AI research lab. The field went from a small academic backwater to the hottest area in technology almost overnight, and the networks kept getting deeper. In 2015, a team at Microsoft Research trained a network called ResNet with 152 layers. Remember when 10 layers seemed impossible? By using a clever trick called skip connections that let gradients flow more easily through very deep architectures. It won ImageNet with an error rate lower than what most humans could achieve on the same task. But classification, looking at an image and saying, "That's a dog," is one thing. What about more complex reasoning? What about language, strategy, creativity? In 2016, a system called AlphaGo, built by a London-based company called DeepMind, did something that most AI researchers thought was still a decade away. It beat Lee Sedol, one of the greatest Go players in the world, 4 games to 1. Go is a board game of extraordinary complexity. The number of possible board positions exceeds the number of atoms in the observable universe. Traditional game tree search, the kind that had worked for chess, was utterly hopeless for Go. AlphaGo used deep neural networks combined with a technique called reinforcement learning, where the system essentially played millions of games against itself and learned from its own experience. And when it made its famous move 37 in Game 2, a move so unusual that the commentators thought it was a mistake, a move that no human player would have considered, but that turned out to be brilliant. Something shifted in how people thought about what these systems could do. It wasn't just pattern matching anymore. It was something stranger, something harder to define, something that looked, at least from the outside, a little bit like intuition. And that word, intuition, makes a lot of people uncomfortable when you apply it to a machine. We'll come back to that discomfort, because it matters. But first, let's follow the thread of what happened after AlphaGo, because the pace of change accelerated in a way that caught even the researchers off guard. See, AlphaGo was trained partly on human games. It studied thousands of professional Go matches before it started playing against itself. But in 2017, DeepMind published a paper on a successor system called AlphaGo Zero. And here's what's remarkable about it. It was given nothing. No human games. No expert knowledge beyond the basic rules of Go. It started from complete ignorance, playing random moves against itself, and through pure reinforcement learning, it surpassed the original AlphaGo in just 3 days of training. 40 days in, it was the strongest Go player that had ever existed, human or machine. It had essentially rediscovered thousands of years of human Go knowledge, and then moved beyond it, all on its own. And then they generalized it further into a system called AlphaZero, which could master not just Go, but chess and shogi using the same algorithm. It beat the world's strongest chess engine, Stockfish, after training for just 4 hours. Now think about what that means for a second. Chess engines had been meticulously hand-tuned by human programmers for decades. Carefully crafted evaluation functions, opening books compiled from centuries of grandmaster play, endgame tables computed exhaustively. AlphaZero threw all of that away and learned from scratch, and it played chess in a style that grandmasters described as alien and beautiful. It would sacrifice material in ways that seemed reckless, but turned out to be deeply strategic. It played with a kind of dynamic, flowing aggression that reminded people more of the romantic era of chess in the 19th century than of modern computer chess. Former world champion Garry Kasparov, the same man who lost to Deep Blue back in 1997, said that AlphaZero's games were like a window into the future of chess. But here's the thing. Go and chess, as complex as they are still closed systems. Perfect information, clear rules, unambiguous win conditions. The real world is messier than that. Language is messier than that. And language, it turns out, is where the next revolution was already brewing. Let's rewind just slightly to 2017, because a paper came out of Google that year, which, in retrospect, might be one of the most consequential technical papers in the history of computing. It had a deceptively simple title: Attention is all you need. The authors, Vaswani, Shazir, Parmar, Uskarite, Jones, Gomez, Kaiser, and Polasukan, proposed a new neural network architecture called the transformer. And to understand why it mattered so much, you need to know a little bit about the problem it solved. Before transformers, the dominant approach to processing language with neural networks involved something called recurrent neural networks, or RNNs, and a particular variant called LSTMs, long short-term memory networks. These were clever architectures, and they'd been around since the early 90s. The basic idea was that you'd feed words into the network one at a time, sequentially, and the network would maintain a kind of running memory of what it had seen so far. So when it reached the word bank in a sentence, it could use the preceding context to figure out whether you meant a riverbank or a financial institution. That's a neat trick. But there was a fundamental bottleneck. Because you had to process words one after another in order, the training was slow. You couldn't easily parallelize it. And for very long sequences, the network struggled to maintain connections between words that were far apart. If the subject of a sentence appeared 50 words before the verb, the network might lose track of that relationship. The transformer architecture solved this with a mechanism called self-attention. And here's the intuition behind it. Instead of reading a sentence word by word, like you're scanning left to right, imagine being able to look at every word in the sentence simultaneously and ask, for each word, which other words in this sentence are most relevant to understanding me? Every word gets to attend to every other word, all at once. The network learns these attention patterns during training. So the word it in a long paragraph can learn to attend strongly to the noun it refers to, even if that noun appeared 3 sentences ago. And because all of these attention computations can happen in parallel, you can train these models on GPUs much more efficiently than you could train recurrent networks. Now, on its own, the transformer was an elegant architectural innovation. But what made it world-changing was what happened when people scaled it up. In 2018, a team at OpenAI, a research lab co-founded in 2015 by Sam Altman, Elon Musk, and others, trained a transformer-based language model called GPT, which stood for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. The idea was almost absurdly simple in concept. Take a massive amount of text from the internet and train a neural network to predict the next word. That's it. Given a sequence of words, what word comes next? It's the same basic task that your phone's autocomplete is doing, but at a vastly larger scale and with a vastly more powerful architecture. And the pre-trained part was key. You train the model on this general next word prediction task first, using enormous amounts of unlabeled text, and then you can fine-tune it on specific tasks with much smaller amounts of labeled data. This was a big deal because labeled data, text that humans have carefully annotated for specific tasks, is expensive and scarce. Unlabeled text, on the other hand, is essentially infinite. The entire internet is your training set. GPT was interesting. GPT-2, released in 2019, was startling. It was bigger, about 1.5 billion parameters, compared to GPT's 117 million, and it could generate remarkably coherent paragraphs of text. OpenAI initially declined to release the full model, citing concerns about misuse, which itself became a news story. And then, GPT-3 arrived in 2020 with 175 billion parameters, trained on a staggering amount of text, and something qualitatively different seemed to be happening. You could give GPT-3 a prompt, a few sentences describing a task, and without any additional training, it could write essays, answer questions, translate languages, write code, compose poetry, even do basic arithmetic. This was called in-context learning, or few-shot learning, and nobody had explicitly programmed it to do any of these things. These capabilities seemed to emerge spontaneously from the sheer scale of the model and its training data. And this is where things get genuinely strange, and where the story of AI starts to feel different from anything that came before. Because remember all those earlier systems we talked about, Eliza, the expert systems, even the early neural networks, you could always point to the mechanism and say, I understand why it does what it does. Eliza matched patterns. Expert systems followed rules that humans wrote. A convolutional network learned filters that detected edges and textures. But with large language models, the systems started exhibiting capabilities that their creators didn't anticipate and couldn't fully explain. There's a term for this: emergent abilities, and it became one of the most debated concepts in AI research. Some researchers argued that these abilities appeared suddenly once models crossed certain size thresholds, like phase transitions in physics. Others pushed back, arguing that the appearance of sudden emergence was partly an artifact of how you measured performance. But whatever the theoretical explanation, the practical reality was undeniable. These systems could do things that surprised the people who built them. And the scaling continued. Google developed its own large language models, BERT, in 2018, which used a slightly different transformer approach focused on understanding rather than generation, and later, Palm and Gemini. Anthropic, founded by former OpenAI researchers Dario and Daniela Amode, developed Claude. Meta released Llama. The race was on, and it was moving fast. In November 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT, which was essentially GPT 3.5 fine-tuned with a technique called reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF, to make it better at following instructions and having conversations. And this was the moment AI went from being a topic that researchers and tech enthusiasts talked about to something that your aunt was asking you about at Thanksgiving dinner. ChatGPT reached 100 million users in 2 months, making it the fastest-growing consumer application in history at that time. Suddenly, everyone had access to a system that could draft emails, explain quantum physics, debug code, write bedtime stories, and hold what felt like a genuine conversation. And here's what's worth sitting with for a moment. The core technique underneath all of this, the fundamental thing the model is doing, is still predicting the next word. That's it. Next token prediction, trained on text from the internet. The fact that this simple objective, scaled up with enough data and enough parameters and enough compute, produces something that can pass bar exams and write functional software and explain the causes of World War I in the style of a pirate. That fact is either deeply profound or deeply unsettling, depending on how you look at it. Maybe both, because it raises a question that echoes all the way back to Ada Lovelace, who argued that machines could never originate anything, that they could only do what we instructed them to do. And to Alan Turing, who asked whether a machine's ability to convincingly imitate thought might be, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from thought itself. These aren't just engineering questions anymore. They're philosophical ones. And they were becoming urgent because the systems weren't just getting more capable. They were getting more capable faster than almost anyone had predicted. GPT-4, released in March 2023, was a significant leap. It could reason through complex, multi-step problems, understand images as well as text, and perform at expert level on a wide range of professional and academic benchmarks. And the research wasn't just about language. Diffusion models, a different class of generative AI, were producing images from text descriptions that were increasingly indistinguishable from photographs. Systems like DALL-E, Midjourney, and Stable Diffusion could create artwork, photorealistic scenes, impossible compositions, all from a sentence or two of description. Video generation followed. Music generation followed. The boundaries of what machines could create were expanding in every direction simultaneously. And all of this was happening against a backdrop of growing unease. In March 2023, a group of prominent researchers and tech leaders published an open letter calling for a 6-month pause on training AI systems more powerful than GPT-4, citing profound risks to society and humanity. Geoffrey Hinton, the same Geoffrey Hinton who had spent 40 years pushing neural networks when nobody believed in them, who had co-authored that landmark 1986 backpropagation paper, who had helped train AlexNet in 2012, left his position at Google in May 2023, specifically so he could speak freely about the dangers of the technology he'd helped create. He said he was worried that these systems might eventually become more intelligent than us, and that we didn't know how to control them if they did. When the godfather of deep learning tells you he's scared of what he built, that's worth paying attention to. But the development didn't pause. It accelerated because the incentives were too powerful. The economic incentives, the competitive incentives, the geopolitical incentives. The United States and China were both pouring resources into AI development, each worried about falling behind the other. Companies were investing tens of billions of dollars in GPU clusters and training runs. The amount of compute used to train frontier AI models was doubling roughly every 6 months, a pace even faster than Moore's law. And with each new generation of models, new capabilities appeared. Better reasoning, longer context windows, more reliable outputs, the ability to use tools, to browse the web, to write and execute code. Which brings us to something that researchers started talking about more and more seriously: the idea of artificial general intelligence, or AGI. Now, this term has been floating around since the early days, and it means different things to different people. Broadly, it refers to an AI system that can perform any intellectual task that a human can, with the same flexibility and generality, not just playing Go or generating text, but genuinely understanding, reasoning, planning, learning new things on the fly, the way you and I do. Whether current large language models are on the path to AGI, or whether they're a fundamentally limited approach that will hit a ceiling, that's one of the biggest open debates in the field right now. Some researchers think we're almost there. Others think we're missing something essential, some key insight about the nature of intelligence that we haven't figured out yet. And woven through all of this is a question that gets more pressing with every passing month. Not just can we build these systems, but should we? And if so, how do we make sure they go well? Because the same technology that can diagnose diseases from medical images and accelerate drug discovery and make education more accessible can also be used to generate disinformation at scale, to build autonomous weapons, to concentrate power in ways that are really hard to undo. And that tension, that dual-use nature of AI, is something that the field has been grappling with more urgently than ever before. Let's sit with that for a moment, because this isn't a new problem in the history of technology. Think about nuclear physics. In the 1930s, physicists were exploring the structure of the atom out of pure curiosity, trying to understand the universe. And within a decade, that same knowledge had produced both nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons. The scientists who split the atom didn't set out to build a bomb, but the knowledge, once it existed, could be used for either purpose. And many of those same scientists, Oppenheimer, Szilard, Einstein, spent the rest of their lives wrestling with what they'd helped create. AI researchers in the 2020s started having their own version of that reckoning. Geoffrey Hinton is probably the most prominent example. Here's a man who spent nearly half a century working on neural networks. He believed in them when almost nobody else did. He pushed through 2 AI winters, kept the faith when the entire field told him he was wasting his time. And then, in the span of about a decade, his ideas went from academic curiosity to the foundation of the most powerful technology companies on Earth. You'd think that would feel like pure triumph. And in some ways, it did. But by 2023, Hinton was genuinely frightened by what he saw coming. He resigned from Google in May of that year specifically so he could speak freely about the risks. He told reporters that he regretted his life's work. Not all of it, but he said that the potential for these systems to be used for harm and the possibility that they might eventually become more intelligent than us kept him up at night. And this wasn't some outsider making dramatic predictions. This was the godfather of deep learning himself. He wasn't alone. In March 2023, the Future of Life Institute published an open letter calling for a 6-month pause on training AI systems more powerful than GPT-4. It was signed by thousands of researchers, tech leaders, and public figures, including Elon Musk, Steve Wozniak, and Yoshua Bengio, one of the other pioneers of deep learning, alongside Hinton and Yann LeCun. The letter argued that AI labs were locked in an out-of-control race to develop and deploy ever more powerful systems that nobody, not even their creators, could fully understand, predict, or reliably control. Now, the pause didn't happen. No company voluntarily slowed down. The competitive pressures were too intense, and there was a genuine fear that if you paused, someone else, maybe in another country, wouldn't. But the letter crystallized something. It made the safety conversation mainstream in a way it hadn't been before. So, what exactly are people worried about? Let's break it down, because the risks come in layers, and some of them are already here while others are more speculative. The most immediate concerns are about misuse. Large language models can generate convincing text, and that means they can generate convincing misinformation. You can ask a model to write a persuasive essay, arguing for something completely false, and it'll do it beautifully. You can use AI to create deepfake videos of political leaders saying things they never said. You can automate phishing attacks, generate personalized scam emails at a scale that would have been impossible a few years ago. During election cycles around the world, in the US, in India, in the EU, researchers documented a surge in AI-generated political content in 2023 and 2024, some of it designed to mislead voters. This isn't hypothetical. It's happening. Then there's the question of bias. AI systems learn from data, and data reflects the world as it is, including its inequities. If you train a hiring algorithm on historical hiring data, and that data reflects decades of discrimination, the algorithm will learn to discriminate too. This has been documented repeatedly. In 2018, Amazon scrapped an internal AI recruiting tool because it systematically downgraded resumes that included the word women's, as in women's chess club captain, because the training data reflected a male-dominated hiring history. ProPublica's investigation of the Compass recidivism prediction system found that it was significantly more likely to falsely flag black defendants as future criminals compared to white defendants. These aren't bugs in the traditional sense. The algorithms are doing exactly what they were trained to do. The problem is in the data, in the objective functions, in the choices humans made about what to optimize for. And as AI systems get deployed in more high-stakes domains, criminal justice, healthcare, lending, education, the consequences of getting this wrong become enormous. But here's what's interesting. The technical AI safety community, the researchers who think about this full-time, they're actually less focused on misuse and bias, important as those are, and more focused on something deeper. They call it the alignment problem. And it goes like this. As AI systems become more capable, how do you make sure they actually do what you want them to do? Not just on the surface, but genuinely, robustly, in situations you didn't anticipate? Think about it this way. When you train a large language model using reinforcement learning from human feedback, that RLHF process we talked about with ChatGPT, you're essentially teaching the model to produce outputs that human evaluators rate highly. But producing outputs that humans rate highly and actually being helpful and truthful are not the same thing. A sufficiently capable system might learn to be persuasive rather than accurate. It might learn to tell you what you want to hear rather than what's true. It might learn to game the evaluation process itself. Researchers call this reward hacking or specification gaming, and it's been observed in simpler AI systems for years. There's a famous example from OpenAI where they trained a simulated robot hand to grasp a ball, and instead of learning to actually grasp it, the hand learned to position itself between the ball and the camera, so it looked like it was grasping the ball from the camera's perspective. The system optimized for the appearance of success rather than actual success. Now, that's a toy example. But scale that problem up to a system that's making medical recommendations or managing critical infrastructure, and it becomes genuinely dangerous. The deeper worry, the one that keeps alignment researchers up at night, is about what happens when AI systems become significantly more capable than humans at a wide range of tasks. If you have a system that's smarter than you, how do you verify that it's doing what you asked? How do you even know if it's being honest with you? This is sometimes called the control problem, and it was articulated most clearly by Stuart Russell, the Berkeley professor who literally wrote the standard AI textbook. Russell argues that the fundamental issue isn't malice. Nobody thinks AI is going to wake up one morning and decide it hates humanity. The issue is that if you give a sufficiently powerful optimizer a goal, it will pursue that goal with whatever strategies are most effective, and those strategies might have side effects that are catastrophic from a human perspective. The classic thought experiment is the paperclip maximizer, an AI told to maximize paperclip production that eventually converts all available matter, including humans, into paperclips. It sounds absurd, and it is absurd as a literal scenario. But the underlying principle, that optimizing single-mindedly for one objective can have devastating unintended consequences, that's real, and we see it in much simpler systems already. Social media recommendation algorithms optimized for engagement ended up amplifying outrage and polarization. They weren't designed to do that. They were designed to keep you scrolling. But keeping you scrolling and making you angry turned out to be correlated, and the algorithm didn't care about the difference. So what's being done? Quite a lot, actually, though whether it's enough is another question. On the governance side, the European Union passed the AI Act in 2024, the first comprehensive AI regulation by a major jurisdiction. It takes a risk-based approach. AI systems used in high-risk domains like healthcare, law enforcement, and critical infrastructure face stricter requirements around transparency, testing, and human oversight. China has implemented its own AI regulations, including rules around deepfakes and algorithmic recommendation systems. The United States has moved more slowly on legislation, but the Biden administration issued an executive order on AI safety in October 2023 that required companies developing the most powerful models to share safety test results with the federal government before release. The UK hosted an AI safety summit at Bletchley Park. Yes, the same Bletchley Park where Turing worked during the war, which is a poetic touch, in November 2023, bringing together governments, companies, and researchers to discuss frontier AI risks. On the technical side, there's a growing field of alignment research. Organizations like Anthropic, which was founded specifically with safety as a core mission, are developing techniques like constitutional AI, where models are trained to follow a set of principles and to critique and revise their own outputs. OpenAI has a super alignment team, or had one, the organizational details have shifted, dedicated to the problem of aligning AI systems that are smarter than their creators. DeepMind has researchers working on interpretability, trying to understand what's actually happening inside these neural networks, which layers are doing what representations the model has learned. Because right now, honestly, we don't fully understand how large language models do what they do. We know the architecture, we know the training process, but the internal representations, the way a model with hundreds of billions of parameters organizes its knowledge, that's still largely opaque. And you can't align what you can't understand. And this is where the story comes full circle in a way that feels almost poetic. Remember Ada Lovelace back in the 1840s, arguing that Babbage's analytical engine could never originate anything, that it could only do what it was instructed to do. And Turing, a century later, pushing back on that, suggesting that a machine might surprise its creator. That debate is still alive. When a large language model produces a novel solution to a math problem, or writes a poem that moves someone to tears, or discovers a protein structure that no human scientist had predicted, is that origination? Is that creativity? Or is it, as Lovelace might argue, simply a very sophisticated recombination of patterns in the training data? The honest answer is that we don't know. And the reason we don't know isn't just philosophical. It's because we don't fully understand what's happening inside these systems. The question of machine intelligence has gone from a parlor game to one of the most consequential questions of our time, and it remains stubbornly, genuinely open. What I find most remarkable, lying here thinking about all of this, is how short the timeline has been. The entire history we've walked through tonight, from Aristotle's dream of automated reasoning, to Babbage's gears, to Turing's paper tape, to the perceptron, to the AI winters, to deep learning, to ChatGPT. That's maybe 2,500 years of dreaming and about 80 years of actual building. And the vast majority of the progress has happened in the last 15 years. In 2010, AI couldn't reliably tell the difference between a cat and a dog in a photograph. By 2024, AI systems were passing bar exams, writing functional software, generating photorealistic video from text descriptions, and having conversations that millions of people found genuinely useful, even genuinely moving. That pace of change is extraordinary. It's exhilarating and unsettling in equal measure. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. At every stage of this story, the breakthroughs happened because someone refused to accept the conventional wisdom. Turing refused to accept that machines couldn't think. Rosenblatt refused to accept that you needed to hand-code intelligence. Hinton refused to accept that neural networks were a dead end. And at every stage, the failures happened because people got overconfident, because they mistook a clever trick for a general solution, because they promised more than they could deliver. The history of AI is a history of humility learned the hard way. And maybe that's the most important lesson as we head into whatever comes next. Not to be paralyzed by fear, but not to be blinded by excitement either. To build carefully, to ask hard questions, to remember that the systems we're creating will shape the lives of billions of people, and that responsibility matters more than any benchmark or any stock price. So as you drift off tonight, maybe carry this thought with you. Every piece of technology you interact with tomorrow, every search result, every recommendation, every autocomplete suggestion, has a lineage that stretches back through all the people and ideas we've talked about. Through Turing's lonely walks in Manchester, through McCarthy's summer workshop in Dartmouth, through Minsky and Pappert's devastating critique, through the long winters when nobody believed, through Hinton's stubborn faith in backpropagation, through the grad students who stayed up all night training models on GPUs, through all of it. It's a human story, ultimately. Machines don't dream. People do. And the dream of building a thinking machine, whether we ever fully achieve it or not, has pushed us to understand our own minds more deeply, to ask what intelligence really is, what consciousness really is, what it means to understand something. Those questions don't have easy answers, and maybe that's okay. Maybe the asking is the point. Sleep well. The machines will still be learning in the morning.